Is a distinguished research professor at York University and Canada Research Chair in Comparative Political Economy. He's the author of several books, including the recent The Making of Global Capitalism, with co-authored with Sam Giddens.
Okay, we're living through the fourth great crisis of capitalism's history. The first in the late 19th century, which lasted a very long time, off and on from 1873 to the mid-1890s. The Great Depression, of course, the 1970s, and now we're in a current crisis which began in 2007, and the end of which is by no means clearly visible. The first great crisis of capitalism, and one has to distinguish between recessions and downturns, crises that last a long time, that are difficult to be contained, that do not give rise to the quick kind of capitalist restructuring that cleanses the weaker elements and strengthens the stronger ones in the chaotic world of capitalist competition. So the first great crisis, as we know very well, gave rise to tremendous inter-imperial rivalry among states which for the most part had just become capitalist. States which had just fostered capitalism for the most part through the latter half of the 19th century. Germany, Japan, even France. Even if Britain was a fully capitalist society by the early 19th century and had gone through an industrial revolution. These were states that had fostered capitalism within them, partly to compete with Britain militarily, but also they had ruling classes that were still heavily invested. And the lights went out on them. That were still heavily invested in a notion of state expansion through territorial conquest rather than capital accumulation. And that were indeed often warrior classes in some respect inside the state. The inter-imperial rivalries, therefore, were not simply capitalist rivalries, they were a mixture of old empires and new capitalist empires that led to world war. With the Depression and the outcome of it in World War II, it looked to a great many people that while the great Marxist theorists of imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century might have been too quick with Lenin to speak of the final stage of capitalism, we could expect that with the Second World War and a return, people thought, inevitable to the conditions of depression after the war economy was removed. That isn't what happened. That isn't what happened in good part, because what Marxists and Hobson expected at the beginning of the 20th century, which was that there was no room for the deepening of accumulation inside the advanced capitalist countries, proved to be wrong. That while, of course, capital will spill over wherever it can go and reconstruct social relations as it does so, the notion that capitalism could not survive unless accumulation took place, not just the rip-off of resources, but accumulation took place in the parts of the world that had not yet become capitalist at the beginning of the 20th century, proved to be incorrect. And this, you can get this out of the theory of Fordism, you can get it out of a Marxist analysis. What happened, and it had partly to do with the victories of trade unions and social democratic and communist parties and social movements in the first half of the 20th century, was that you could have a deepening of capital accumulation within the advanced capitalist field. And of course, for the most part, it was not by virtue of the spread of capitalism and the rip-off of resources and the realization of profits in the global south that you got the tremendous boom after World War II. It was by virtue of the deepening of capitalism in some of those countries. Now, that went along with, of course, and in this sense, Kautsky turned out to be more right than Lenin, that went along with a condominium of ruling classes, whereby the American empire became the representative of the American state, became the representative of property around the world. It was the guarantor of property around the world. And European and Japanese ruling classes looked to the American state to refound their capitalist economies in the face of, and even in Japan, a very strong communist movement. And in any case, they were equally frightened of militant trade unions and even labor-type social democracy as came to a majority government in Britain in 1945. So they looked to the American state to facilitate their reconstruction as capitalist states, and that's very largely what happened. There was an enormous period of accumulation, so much so that most Marxists, when they measure the falling rate of profit now, usually begin in 1963, 64, 65, as if that were the beginning of capitalism. But that post-war period entered into crisis. In my view, it wasn't a crisis of, in any sense, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall because of a particular relationship between organic and variable capital. I think it was a product of class struggle from below having effects on the capitalist system under conditions of full employment, whether in terms of direct wage pressure on profits, whether in terms of workers resisting productivity increase and technological change, whether in terms of social movements pushing up the social wage and causing the fiscal crisis of the state, as Jim O'Connor predicted it better than anybody and saw it better than anybody at the beginning of the 1970s. What was interesting about the crisis of the 70s that it did not lead to inter-imperial rivalry.
So what?
Inter-imperial rivalry. What was expected was that a crisis always did, right? And it didn't. Mandel was wrong. Right? He looked at Europe, he looked at the combining of Europe, the creation of the common market, and he expected that what we were seeing with the competition coming from Europe and Japan and the crisis of the 70s was therefore a return to interstate conflict among advanced capitalist countries. On the contrary, what happened during the course of the 70s, of course there was a lot of elbowing for space, there was some tension, was a common working out of policies that did involve, of course, jettisoning aspects of the welfare state, introducing financial discipline, above all, removing what had always been seen by the post-war makers of global capitalism as temporary expedients. They lasted much longer than we hoped they would. Removal of capital controls, etc. And that those deregulations, the jettisoning, if you like, of the welfare state and the New Deal state, was not just a matter of people with Hayekian ideas suddenly coming to the fore and getting a hearing. It was precisely because those welfare measures, the New Deal regulations, had run into contradictions in the face of an incredibly dynamic and expanding capitalism by the 1960s and 1970s. The baby had outgrown the incubator of the New Deal reforms, and they couldn't regulate. You were trying to maintain an interest rate ceiling on what banks could offer you in order to put your money in the bank. And the banks could go into the European dollar market to raise money, make it and bring that money back to the United States. Made it impossible for the Federal Reserve to manage the money supply. The regulations, in other words, were not able to cope with the baby that outgrew the incubator. It was under those conditions that Hayekian ideas started to be heard. Although the people who introduced the deregulation understood much better than Hayek ever understood that insofar as you open up markets to competition, you need more regulation by state. You need the ability for capitalists to adjudicate contract disputes amongst them. You need all kinds of forms of guarantees that property will be defended all around the world. Therefore, you need free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, etc. As Polanyi pointed out in the 19th century, you never have expanding markets without expanding states, without expanding legal systems, without expanding regulatory agencies, and that's what we got. Right? A much larger role for the Federal Reserve than it ever played. A much larger role for the Treasury than it had ever played in the era of the dynamic neoliberal period of the last quarter of the 20th century. Unlike Brenner and unlike Radika, Sam and I are of the view that there was a massive restructuring of capital, in fact, enormous exit after 1983. You got a restructuring of American capital, with some segments of it, of course, being hollowed out, but other segments of it going through the kind of dynamism that perhaps has never been seen in any earlier period of capitalism. So, I was on a panel with Josh Freeman yesterday morning. He has a fantastic chapter in his book on American Empire, which is about American Empire home, on what happened to the meat industry, on what happened to the slaughterhouses. Yes, of course, the old slaughterhouses were wiped out, but there was a transformation of the meat industry in this country, now based on low, often ununionized labor, but with the type of productivity and technology increases that are phenomenal and that have led one foreign capital after another that used to lead in the meat sector, Brazil, Argentina, etc., to be investing in the American meatpacking industry and buying it up. So it was a very dynamic, I'm leaving aside here, that's an old industry, I'm leaving aside, of course, biotechnology, the communications revolution that's transformed our own lives, etc., etc. It was combined with financialization, and a lot of that financialization was, of course, enormously speculative. But that financialization was productive to that restructuring. It helped provide the discipline for that restructuring, the discipline that turned General Electric from what it was previously engaged in to what it is now engaged in. And if you didn't subject yourself to that discipline, you found yourself as a board of directors bought out by some financial hedge fund, who then imposed discipline on the structure of the industry. It was a dynamic period of capitalism we lived through, and finance was functional to it in another way. It was, of course, one of increasingly integrated global production. American MNCs sell 3/4 of what they produce abroad, not in the United States. Apart from the fact that the United States exported more than any other G7 country from 1981, their exports increased more than any other G7 country since '81. Of course, imports increased all the more, which is why you had the balance of payments. Finance was functional to that integrated production, the kind of thing that leads a Chinese capitalist to be a source of what we buy at Walmart, what workers buy at Walmart, more cheaply than what they were able to buy before on Main Street, which allows them to reproduce themselves as workers at a lower wage than they used to get. Okay. And that integrated production requires financialization. The largest derivative markets are in foreign exchange markets, over 50% of them. That Japanese exporter cannot sign that contract with Walmart in say, April, unless he's able to buy a derivative product that guarantees that when he delivers that product next October, he's doing it at an exchange rate that still allows him to make a profit. This is nothing new. American and Canadian farmers learned this with futures markets in the 1880s. Now, most of this is speculative, of course, but it's also necessary to this chaotic but integrated global capitalist production. Okay, this was a recovery of a dynamic capitalism that was, however, very prone to crisis. Very prone to crisis because finance, which is is now so central to this integrated global production, is highly volatile. There were 72 financial crises in the 1970s, most of them in low and middle income countries, as they were brought into globalization. And it wasn't mainly the IMF and its discipline that drove them in. It was their ruling classes which understood that ISI wasn't working and which wanted to accumulate not only within their own territories, but didn't have the kind of political balance of forces inside their own countries to often see that through. The IMF was then very helpful to get them to see the reforms through that they wanted in order to open themselves up to global accumulation. A highly volatile system, and the American Treasury understood it very well. The most important report they produced during the 90s was one that says we cannot any longer be in the business of failure containment. Because if we're in the business of failure containment vis-a-vis the financial system, we're undermining the production of the type of instruments that are important to integrated global production. All we can do now is be engaged in failure containment. And there was a series of financial crises, the Mexican peso crisis, the Asian crisis, you name it, which were hair-raising for them and they didn't sleep nights. But they managed to contain so that they didn't turn into what we've just been through. It's not surprising that the one that they couldn't manage was one that was homegrown, although I think Braddock is absolutely right to say it was homegrown only insofar as capital kept flowing into the United States, including the Chinese reinvesting their surplus from their exports in the United States. Because after all, New York has the deepest financial markets and the Treasury bill is the safest place to put your money. And if there's going to be a run on your currency, you'd better have a lot of very safe assets to prevent that run. Okay. What's happened in this crisis, I'll just end with this. We do not see interstate conflict. As in the 1970s, we see instead the desperate attempt on the part of ruling classes in their states around the world to manage this crisis together. Oh yes, again, there's tensions and elbow room. The Brazilians complain that the enormous quantitative easing has an effect on the Brazilian dollar, and it does. Right? One of its ironic effects is that capital comes pouring into Brazil as capitalists look for higher rates of return. But the remarkable thing is that the Chinese, when the American Congress tries to put a ceiling on the Treasury's ability to borrow, the Chinese come out and say this is highly irresponsible since the Americans are responsible for managing the world economy and the dollar is the central currency. All of the bullshit that we heard immediately after 1907 about there will no longer be a dollar-based economy, the American dollar has never been more central to the global economy than it is now, and it's for one reason. And that is, if you're a capitalist and you're looking for a secure state that guarantees property around the world, it's the American state you look to, not the Indian state. Although heaven knows, the Indian state is scrambling to be as integrated into global capitalism as it possibly can. And its capitalists are investing actually more in African agriculture at the moment than they are in Indian agriculture at the moment. There's class conflict inside all these countries. And if we're Marxists, what we want to be looking for, what we want to be hopeful about, is not the tensions that may arise between this or that third world developing capitalist state. But rather what we want to be looking for is what leadership will we find from class struggles inside the South that will take us beyond the way in which class struggles in the North got integrated through the course of the 20th century. Will the strike waves in China end up in a struggle for, I want more commodities of a private kind? Or will the enormous strike waves in China be about trying to find a way to the production of collective services through democratic economic planning? That's what we want to be asking, not whether we're about to see a conflict between ruling classes in the South, which I don't think is going to happen, and ruling classes in the North. Thank you.